Good morning from Washington, D.C. My name is Lauren Reese, and together with my colleagues in the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program and our partners at Adelphi, it's a privilege to welcome you all to this Berlin Climate Security Conference panel. Today, we're going to take a close look at the progress made and, shall we say, the opportunities remaining for the U.S. government and its partners to more effectively address climate and security. It goes without saying that the climate ambition of the Biden administration represents a significant pivot for the US government on these issues compared to the previous administration. But it's actually more than that. The executive actions that President Biden has taken signal an intention to meaningfully integrate climate considerations and climate security across US foreign and domestic decision making. So this is not about turning a car around, it's about turning a tanker around, taking a huge, complex bureaucracy and transforming how it has traditionally dealt with just about everything. As this conference has shown over the last week, our understanding of what constitutes climate security, how to look at climate risks, and how to respond to those risks has grown by leaps and bounds over the last decade. So today, we have a truly rockstar panel of speakers who are leading the effort to build those systems and mechanisms for applying this knowledge across US government agencies and with our international partners. I'm going to start with some brief introductions. From there, I'll pose some initial questions to the panel, aiming for more of an open discussion than panel presentations. We'll reserve the last 30 minutes or so for questions from the audience. So please do send your questions via email to ecsp@wilsoncenter.org, and we'll do our best to include them in the discussion. I'm so pleased to be introducing USAID's newly on board agency climate coordinator, Gillian Caldwell. Gillian is responsible for overseeing all climate and environment work across USAID and also serves as Deputy Assistant Administrator, overseeing the Bureau for Development, Democracy, and Innovation's Center for Environment, Energy, and Infrastructure, and the Office of Environmental and Social Risk Management. Gillian has a long track record of protecting human rights and the environment, including as the CEO of Global Witness and founder of a campaign with more than 600 allied organizations to pass legislation in the US to address the climate crisis, all the way back in 2007. Jennifer DeCicero is the Director for Climate Security and Resilience in the National Security Council's Climate and Energy Directorate. Her work is at the intersection of climate change and national security, with a focus on how the accelerating effects of climate change impact the institutional, economic, and social resilience of society. Jennifer was previously at the Department of Energy, where she served as the Director for Recovery and Critical Energy Infrastructure and led the department's long-term energy sector disaster recovery effort. Stephanie Epner is Senior Advisor to the Special Presidential Envoy for Climate Change at the U.S. Department at State. And just to clarify, we will be calling this SPEC from here on out, I think, in the discussion. It's too much of a mouthful. So the SPEC office, as well as the climate lead on the Secretary of State policy planning staff. Stephanie served in the Obama administration at both the State Department and the Environmental Protection Agency, then stepped away from government to stand up and lead the Climate and Foreign Policy Project at the UN Foundation. Before rejoining the State Department under the current administration, Stephanie was co-lead for international climate policy on the Biden-Harris transition team. And finally, Roger Polwardy is the senior scientist in NOAA's Physical Sciences Division, Boulder, Colorado. He has served as lead author for the IPCC, the U.S. National Climate Assessments, and UNDRR. Roger's a longtime leader in institutionalizing interdisciplinary approaches to program design and serves as an advisor on early warning and adaptation to a number of national and international agencies, including the UN, the Organization of American States, and the Inter-American Development Bank. You all really represent the brain trust of U.S. government action on climate security, and I'm excited to get to the discussion. One last reminder that you can send your questions into ecsp@wilsoncenter.org at any point in the conversation, and we will allow time the second half to get those questions. So let's get started. President Biden's January 27th executive order renewed the United States climate objectives, leadership, and global climate ambition. It also placed climate at the center of US foreign policy and national security in ways that don't just pick up where the Obama administration left off, but are meant to be more responsive in today's context. So I'm gonna cheat a little bit here and ask you all the same questions to start with. And I think, Jennifer, we'll start with you. Can you talk about what this has meant for your agency and for your portfolio?
Sure. Thanks, Lauren. As you mentioned in your introductory remarks, addressing the climate crisis is really a core priority for the Biden-Harris administration. and is an essential element of the United States foreign policy and national security posture now. With over 85% of global emissions coming from outside the US, President Biden really understands the critical role the United States must play in the global climate effort, and addressing it involves global action. As we're all seeing, impacts of climate change are multidimensional, and we're seeing these effects increasing daily, both here at home and around the globe. And we understand that each of these effects pose a significant threat to security and stability around the globe. And not only are we looking at physical effects, and this is where I think is really important as we talk about changes to the National Security Council, we're really understanding the impact of climate change can exacerbate underlying political, social, and economic conditions, and potentially provoking or increasing a new conflict. These impacts then have the potential to destabilize regions and undermine our ability to successfully execute peacekeeping operations and other shared security priorities. So early in the administration, the interim national security strategic guidance was released. And within that, you saw the president committing to elevating climate change as a top national security priority. So what does that mean in practice here? The administration is really taking a transformational approach that includes domestic actions on climate that then give lift to our ability to lead globally and implement international actions that demonstrate our commitment. Within the National Security Council, climate change was elevated to its own directorate. It had not ever previously had its own directorate within the NSC. The Senior Director for Climate and Energy now reports directly to the National Security Advisor and the Principal Deputy National Security Advisor. And this really demonstrates the integral role that the administration sees climate having across all of our regional engagements. So yes, we're focused on climate and energy, but we're also integrating these key priorities within our regional engagements with countries around the world. Within this directorate, the NSC is proactively integrating climate change and energy issues. We've begun a process to evaluate and, where necessary, calibrate our international energy engagement posture to align with the administration's climate and energy policies. And we are, for the first time, addressing the challenges around climate security. We like to talk about it as creating new muscles and new muscle memory around how we approach these really once siloed challenges and questions. Climate has historically within the US government been kind of off to the side, but it is now integrated across everything that we do. But this is going to require us to look at and weigh alternatives against each other, and at times make some hard decisions to reconcile our approaches. As you'll see from my colleagues who are on the panel as well today, we're really taking a whole of government approach to address the challenges posed by climate change. We're building new habits of cooperation and really putting in place new structures to keep our progress on climate change moving within the administration. And we really view the Climate and Energy Directorate here at the NSC as kind of central to helping facilitate those changes.
Thank you, Jennifer. I love that creating new muscles and muscle memory. It's a great metaphor to think of this as sort of a long-lasting shift, right, in the way things are done. Stephanie, let's go to you. You're in a unique position at State. You're working in both a new office with Secretary Kerry's team and on the policy planning team. So you probably have a pretty unique perspective on what this has meant for State Department. Can you give us some comments on that?
Excuse me, sorry. Yes, it definitely is a fundamental shift. A lot of muscle memory is being developed on our end as well. But we have a really unprecedented situation with the return of Secretary Kerry to serve in this brand new role. Obviously, underscoring the desire to elevate climate change. We have a former Secretary of State whose only focus day in and day out is on climate and energy, who is traveling all the time, including right now, he's in Europe, meeting with everyone from heads of state to climate negotiators to business leaders and sort of everyone in between. every day to focus on increasing global ambition. He has a team that he has built of a lot of tried and true experts who have been, many of whom negotiated the Paris Agreement and have been working on these issues in the private and public sector for years. But we wanted to make sure as well that in elevating this new role that is based, the staff works at the State Department, that the rest of the department still understands it's a whole of department priority, that in elevating Secretary Kerry and having that person at the very top focused on this every day, that everybody in the department takes this on as their mission as well. And that's sort of the idea also behind my role, where I focus on tying the work of the spec team, as we say, to the broader policy development going on in the department, making sure that every bureau, every functional bureau, so the bureaus that focus on things like human rights and trade and economic policy, and all the regional bureaus, that their assistant secretaries, their leadership, the ambassadors that serve in the field, and all of the staff that serves in every post is brought into the climate diplomacy a little bit, and also more broadly, just looking at the challenges on their plate through a climate lens, that they're making these climate security connections, and broadening that definition of climate security to understand the way that economics are related to climate change, human rights are affected by climate change, and hard security challenges are affected by climate change. This is something that Secretary Blinken's tried to underscore as well. He recently put out a large policy guidance cable that goes to every post, every mission we have in the world, and directs them basically to join this effort. It gives some sort of specific actions that they can be taking to be part of it, and really tries to underscore that, yes, we have a former Secretary of State who's leading this work on the climate diplomacy front, but it's his mission too as Secretary of State. Secretary Blinken's. And we just really wanted to underscore that we need to build new muscle. This is an unprecedented level of attention. I served in the State Department in the Obama administration when Secretary Kerry was secretary. And he's always been really focused on climate change, and certainly was then, and tried to elevate it. But this is at a new level, I think, this coordination between the two and across the administration, really, the focus that President Biden has placed on it has lit a fire, so to speak, I think, across the leadership of the administration. And hopefully more and more people are understanding that just because they don't work, the climate's not in their title, doesn't mean it's not an integral part of their policy that they need to be working on every day. And that's what we're trying to do.
We'll come back and hear a little bit more about how you're doing it every day too. Gillian, USAID has traditionally had a strong focus on natural resource management and the environment, given developing countries' reliance on agriculture and natural resources. But climate change is changing much of the context in which this work is taking place. So what has the renewed focus on climate meant for the agency?
Yeah, I mean, everything that we heard from Jen and Stephanie was, familiar to me, very much ringing in my ears. I think we're all having the same experience of really trying to think and do things in a very, very different way. At AID, the NSC and the State Department and SPEC especially are core to our ability to succeed on that front. So we're trying not just to reinforce the importance of a whole of agency response, but also a whole of government response. And, that requires umpteen sub-IPCs and meetings and coordinations and memos. And, I'm sure our clearance trackers are all, a mile long. Our administrator power has made it abundantly clear that climate change is one of the very top priorities at USAID. Talk about a pivot. This is moving from a scenario in which you really couldn't use the words climate and change in the same sentence, in which, climate related work was buried and renamed. And, my innovative colleagues at the department managed to keep the wheels turning to some extent, but face significant funding challenges and, of course, all sorts of political pressures to look the other way. So I've been brought in. I'm not the first agency-wide climate change coordinator, but I think I'm fortunate to be the first who is leading in a scenario where it's really a top priority for the agency. We're in the midst of developing a comprehensive agency-wide strategy. It's been a highly participatory process, engaging people all across the agency, all of the bureaus, all of the missions around the world. And we'll be looking to release a strategy for external review alongside some very ambitious targets in terms of climate mitigation and adaptation and climate finance. And systems change, actually, which is a very interesting component of our intended strategy at the COP. So yeah, it's an exciting time, and it's a challenging time because, people are coming to understand and want to recognize this as a central priority, and at the same time figuring out how to accommodate that in the context of everything else and determine its relationship and resource the work is a critical challenge.
Roger, I lied to you. I'm going to change my question for you a little bit.
That's quite all right.
Okay.
I'll give you the same answer.
Science and data, analytic tools, etc., are critical to understanding climate security risks,
Absolutely.
but also potential responses. NOAA is an important part of the interagency, of course, but you sit in a unique organizational position where you're actually working to enable science-based work across the U.S. government and with foreign partners. And much of this is with an eye towards better coordination of science and policy for understanding and responding to climate risks. So can you talk us through a little bit about, how has this work evolved? Do you feel like we're headed in the right direction?
Excellent question, and I do want to build on the previous comments, and especially the last comment from Gillian on, yes, the challenges are immense and they're multidimensional, and within the portfolios of what we're accountable for and what we can act on, we're trying to find the space in which we interact more effectively. So I'll hit on maybe three kinds of concepts there when we're thinking about this. The coherence, the alignment, and the agility, right? The ability to respond when we're trying to align across a whole of government approach. And we're hearing that from everyone on the panel. And it is, in fact, embedded in how we're thinking. Now, for decades, we talked about the notion of mainstreaming. And we felt that mainstreaming was just a risk analysis kind of thing, where you sort of say, okay, how do I get climate variables into planning? When in fact, mainstreaming is what you heard the last speakers talk about. How do we align a different way of thinking and a different use in the value of science as we're doing its applications? So in that context, as we work across the agency, as everyone knows, monitors and studies everything from solar flares down to the ocean floor, we're seeing the changing nature of risks, not simply are there droughts, floods, and what the trends in those are, but what we're calling, and has been called, systemic risk, the globally networked connections in water, energy, and food. To pay attention to those requires the information that we provide, the partnerships that we develop, but also the fact that we work and cannot answer those questions without other groups. And I'll give you a couple of examples. The Corps of Engineers has developed the climate risk information decision analysis tool on water resources. NOAA inherently looks at how are our water resources and extremes changing, droughts and floods, how are they aligned? The Famine Early Warning System Network within the State Department, USGS, NOAA, NASA, other partners, working with people on the ground on how they respond to risks. Now, what that means, however, is that we need to have regionally specific, reliable information that is driven by what we understand globally. So there are Earth system prediction initiatives that we have that all of the agencies are engaged in. And as we think through that, how we align to develop that regional and local, reliable and specific information requires the development agencies or partners and others to produce that coherent, aligned, and agile approach. Global trends matter, but events trigger our responses. And we see that in migration, we see that in hazard management. And so it's that cross time scale and cross link between risk and resilience, between weather and climate and ocean variability that requires the whole of government approach, because we are dealing with the entire Earth system and potential thresholds and changes within it. As Gillian's last point mentioned, aligning our capabilities is not a straightforward task, but you're hearing a deliberate effort to do so to produce that coherence. That is absolutely needed. Great, thanks.
Roger. I think that takes me back to Jennifer, if we can come back to you for a minute, thinking about, there's clearly a strong intention, there's positions in place and a lot of movement. But we've also heard a lot that there's been some challenges. Well, there's a lot of staffing up, right? Just building up the capacity within and across agencies to do this work. So can you talk to us about how the USG agencies are currently equipped to work on climate security, and what capacity is there? What capacity are you working to build up? And how do you see climate security fitting specifically into some of this work on climate?
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. I mean, that's a really big question, right? I think, as was previously noted by a number of speakers, climate change was not a priority over the last 4 years. And as such, the agencies lost a lot of resources from a staffing perspective in these areas. We're seeing that change given just the absolute priority that this administration is placing on climate. I would go back to a point that Gillian made, though, about colleagues at USAID actually maintaining work on climate. It may not have been kind of labeled as such, but I do think and have seen, and having been at the Department of Energy at the time, a lot of related work continued on just under, a different umbrella, if you will. So, we're also seeing now, just given the significant executive orders that were released early in the administration and the ask of departments and agencies across the government, that signal was sent by the administration that this is a priority, and agencies have been responding in kind. One other comment I would make before I get into a few more specifics is that, I think, and Stephanie referenced viewing things through a climate lens, and I think that's where we're seeing a shift now as well. So I think there's a lot of work that has been underway, even, the work that I was doing at DOE on disaster recovery. It really has a nexus to climate security and perhaps wasn't really thought about as such. And so I think we're kind of evolving the narrative and, shifting how we are thinking about climate and climate security across the U.S. government. A couple of kind of specifics that I would like to call out here that I think are really important and are kind of foundational to the climate security portfolio that we are building out here, both at the NSC, but across the U.S. government. Within the broader climate executive order that was issued very early in the administration, there were two kind of foundational assessments that were called for. One by the Director of National Intelligence, looking and calling for the first ever national intelligence estimate on climate change that was published within the last couple of weeks. This is really something we have not seen previously, and really provides kind of a new foundational assessment that we can build on our work in this space. The second is asking the Department of Defense to develop the first ever climate risk analysis for the department. So really looking at how climate is affecting operations, readiness, et cetera, across the DoD complex. And then using that, there's kind of a second order coming. That's not just to do the analysis, but then integrate that analysis and how the National Defense Strategy is being developed and other key strategy documents, exercises, wargaming, et cetera, across DoD. The third assessment that I think is really important and gets into some of the specifics that have come up is in a separate executive order looking at the nexus between climate change and migration. And I think that's a way that we're actually starting to look at those second and third order effects from climate change. So not just looking at climate through a pure security lens, but how is this impacting things like water security, food security, et cetera, and then having these potential implications on people movement, et cetera. And the last piece I would pull out here is that the administration has really emphasized from the beginning evidence-based decision making, and I would say the very central role and involvement of the science agencies in development of all three of these foundational assessment documents is absolutely critical, and really critical to note and to highlight. Because I think where we are today, where we may not have been kind of at the the end of the Obama administration, was we were really working to pull these together, right? In better integrating the science and the science community into policymaking. And I would say that we are in a different position today, and just the kind of critical role that they have played just in these early months in helping shape and inform these initial assessments is really important.
Thanks, Jennifer. Could you take a minute to talk about the significance of having a national intelligence estimate on climate change? For folks maybe not in the U.S. who might not be familiar, or even in the U.S. who may not be familiar with the significance of these different kinds of assessments and tools that are developed, the National Intelligence Estimate in particular would be interesting to hear a little bit more about.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much I can kind of get into details on this, but it's, looking at some of the things that, we were talking about earlier, and with respect to looking at some of being able to look at how climate is, either directly or indirectly, impacting having geopolitical security implications, et cetera. And so this is just something that has not been done previously.
Will it provide sort of a basis for a stronger message of the need to integrate climate change then across agency priorities? So, I mean, I think there's a lot of people who understand the significance of climate security for non-climate focused portfolios, and then there's some that still haven't sort of made that leap. And so it's something like the National Intelligence Estimate sort of help sort of promote even internally the importance of this work.
I could chime in for a second, Lauren, if that's okay. I think the one thing, just for context, again, without getting into any of the details of a classified document, it is the most elevated intelligence product that we have in the U.S. government. The NIE is the most comprehensive intelligence product that we have. So directing one on this issue, that's what's never been done. Of course, there's been some intelligence assessments in the past, and I think there's an unclassified, or it was declassified, report from the National Intelligence Council in 2016 that went into some of these effects. It just wasn't quite as comprehensive. It didn't require as many of the resources in compiling it, and it wasn't briefed at as high of levels as this assessment will be. So I do think that there is significance, and of course we're not using it. There's not a political sort of way to use this intelligence and direct policy that way, but certainly we wanted to give everybody. But we hope everybody will get a more detailed understanding of what we're talking about when we say climate change is an issue of serious national security consequence.
Definitely. And actually, I'm gonna switch gears for a minute and switch to you and the COP, which is coming up in a couple months. Can you talk a little bit about how the SPEC office has worked to incorporate climate security into the U.S. approach to the UNFCCC and into partnerships with foreign leaders, and what does this mean as we head
Yeah.
toward COP26?
So I think for COP26, I will say just more broadly, when we're looking at climate security, we really are trying to think about it holistically. And we're certainly, and I can get into a little bit more when we talk about the COP in just a second, but more broadly, in all of the diplomacy that we're doing in multilateral fora across the board, particularly at organizations that that focus on security. We are trying to elevate climate change. We view it as central to any sort of security planning or cooperation that we're doing. So that you saw in the NATO Leaders Summit earlier this year, the leaders adopted the Climate and Security Action Plan, which goes into some of the ways that NATO members will be integrating climate security into their thinking and strategy. We also are doing this in organizations like the OSCE with our European partners, and also at the UN Security Council, where last week there was an open debate during the UN General Assembly. Was it last week? I don't know. Time is a mystery to me at this point. Last week, okay. The Secretary Blinken spoke there, along with a number of other leaders and foreign ministers, about the role that climate security should play, a much more expanded role in the deliberations of the Security Council and the resolutions that it puts forward. With the COP, I think, again, we don't want to save the COP for all of the climate issues that we have, but climate security we view is certainly tied to the issues that will be front and center at the COP. So there's a lot of focus on mitigation, on emissions reduction, which of course reduces the severity of some of the threats that we're looking at in the future. But also the focus on climate finance and adaptation. That is certainly, there's moral reasons to be delivering much more climate finance, but there are also clear security reasons. We know that some of the most vulnerable countries to climate change in the world are also the most fragile states in the world. So getting a significant increase in our climate finance is going to be huge for our ability to wrap our arms around security challenges as well, not just at home, but overseas with our partners. So that's one of the reasons why there was a really significant push in the administration to move forward with the announcement that the president made last week as well at the UN General Assembly, where we're going to be, in April, he announced we are doubling our climate finance from the Obama level peak to 5.7 billion. And then last week, he announced that we're going to go further and double that again. It's not enough globally. We're doing everything that we can do to drive our partners to also contribute more. But we understand that need. I think that will be a key focus at the COP is adaptation and resilience, along with the mitigation focused negotiations.
What about, so we, understanding climate interacts with, it can cause insecurity, right? But through different drivers. What about, responses to climate change, unintended sort of consequences with climate responses that don't have a conflict sensitive lens, right? You mentioned that a lot of the countries most vulnerable to climate change are also conflict affected and fragile. And so has there been much thought to bringing that conflict sensitive lens to the COP and the need to sort of respond with our eyes wide open, put it another way?
Certainly. I think that we are, and for us, I think there's a need for the climate negotiators to focus and to be mindful of those things as they're in the room and deliberating. I think also that most of the people that are attending the COP understand some of this to a certain degree, but you're absolutely right that the education goes both ways. There's the educating a lot of the sort of standard national security practitioners and foreign policy folks who are not necessarily focused on climate change, on the climate implications for their work. But there's also helping the climate focused experts understand the ways that geopolitical situations and current tensions that those can be affecting. It's sort of a vicious cycle. with climate change. And really, one of the reasons why I think that what Jennifer mentioned with the NSC restructuring, why that's so important and why we're trying to mirror that to a certain extent at the State Department and across the interagency, is because those conversations haven't traditionally happened so much. Connecting those dots between those two communities is really essential if we're going to go in with our eyes wide open, as you said, be strategic in how we're responding, and making sure that we are seeing the whole board as we look to the future.
And so now let's go from sort of that multilateral conversation down to the ground, Gillian, where USAID is so effective. And I think Roger touched on this too, right? This is sort of about working across the scales of decision making, and USAID plays a strong role in that with its on the ground operations and connections with communities on the ground that are really facing the impacts of climate change today. How has USAID come to understand climate security as part of development, and how well positioned is the agency to incorporate it into the work of the field missions? So in what, and I have a second question, but I think I'll let you answer that first.
Yeah, so just, stepping back for context, and, apologies for those of you that know this, but, climate change, without urgent action, climate change could push a further 100 million people into poverty. So at the agency, that's of concern, especially given some hard-fought development gains. But additionally, this climate variability really undermines food and water security. It negatively affects health and well-being. It contributes to disasters, conflict, displacement, economic disruption, and, very importantly, it really exacerbates existing global inequities, which are so significant, and, which the agency is really prioritizing moving forward. But interestingly, despite a lot of sort of attention-grabbing headlines that suggest a very clear causal connection between climate and conflict, the research indicates that the links are complex and indirect. So I think what climate does is it drives a range of problems which precipitate conflict. So in areas where you have pastoral herders who have managed to coexist, notwithstanding some underlying tensions for a period of time, when drought arrives without the right systems in place, without the right governance, without the right land tenure, significant conflict can arise. So a lot of what we have done historically is really think carefully about how we can strengthen the formal and informal institutions to prevent or mitigate conflict over climate-affected resources. I think we did that quite effectively with our partners in the Sahel, in Nigeria and Burkina Faso, where we really had to design a project with a very climate security mindset. So, a focus on water security and more productive land use and risk management helped create the conditions for some peaceful coexistence, notwithstanding the real pressures that they were facing in their natural environment. So that's another interesting point, which is that as much as it's a driver of conflict, it can also be what I would call a crisistunity, right? It precipitates peace building efforts if you're proactive in thinking and anticipating those potential underlying risks, and you move into thinking carefully about resource sharing agreements and diversifying livelihoods so there's not so much dependency on on a few scarce resources. So I think the agency is well placed in that we have, of course, all of this longstanding history working, especially in agricultural contexts throughout the world. And we also have had some real embedded expertise when it comes to climate security and conflict. I think the challenge is going to be to bring those teams together in a more deliberate way to make sure that they're really thinking strategically at the outset in terms of project design and implementation. And this goes back to that whole of agency response.
speaking of the whole of agency response, you're working on a new USAID climate strategy. Could you talk a little bit about how it might address the nexus of climate fragility and peace building more specifically?
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, one of the core principles underlying this strategy that we're developing is really going to be equity and inclusion. So what that means is thinking about Indigenous peoples, women and girls who are often hit first and worst in these kinds of contexts, marginalized local communities who are left out of consultation and decision making. So I think the more we prioritize a focus on communities who are, first of all, in very disadvantaged and disempowered situations, but also, especially where Indigenous communities are involved, in a remarkable position to continue to steward natural resources if we allow them to. We can get at some of the root causes and drivers of conflict much more effectively. So that's one very concrete example, is to bring that sort of equity and climate justice lens to the work we're doing. Another example is, further to Stephanie's point about mobilizing finance. President Biden has committed to striving for 11.4 billion per year in public finance for climate. And that is, I can tell you, because I've been in many of these interagency conversations with our budget director, going to be quite a challenge. And needless to say, we've got to convince Congress to come with us along the way. But, aid takes our responsibility really seriously in the context of delivering that climate finance. And, as Stephanie alluded to, this gets at a core national security dimension. If we don't actually enable countries who didn't create this problem to respond to it and to increase their own ambition under the Paris Agreement, we could have really cataclysmic results in terms of national security. So those are just a few of the ways, I think, in which we're trying to think about this. The other thing I'd say is, we have this focus on systems change we're proposing. So while we're looking at direct action in the areas of reducing emissions and building resilience and mobilizing finance and equity, we're also thinking about what we can do to transform the underlying systems that both drive the inequity and preclude a transition to a net zero future. So what does it look like to create an enabling environment for private investment so that renewable energy can thrive? President Biden in his executive order also directed agencies to stop subsidizing fossil fuels directly, which is enormous. I mean, renewable energy has become competitive, notwithstanding the barriers of production subsidies, for example. So what can we do in countries around the world to create the kinds of environments in which this capital can flow and, we can really get where we need to go in terms of carbon emissions and new governance structures in which we actually have a price on carbon.
Jennifer, so we've sort of heard from different agencies and some of the coordination across, but can you give us a little bit more of a specific update on the ongoing and planned efforts to address climate security across U.S. government agencies and some of that coordinating aspect that you're working so closely on, as well as sort of the international aspect of that coordination? And Stephanie and Roger, you can probably jump in on that aspect too. But so sort of talking about the interagency coordination, Jennifer, start with.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. I think the one element that I didn't talk about earlier that's relevant to the climate security space from the climate executive order that was released early in the administration was it's like an onion. You have to go a few layers down. But the EO reinstated a presidential memorandum from the end of the Obama administration that created a climate and national security working group. And so the reinstatement of that working group is underway, and I think will be foundational for kind of being a platform for long-term and consistent coordination among the interagency. I think the drivers for that, the creation of that working group in the 2015 timeframe, were different than today. You know, and I noted this earlier, I think just given the priority that this administration is placing on climate and elevating climate, you know, as core to our national security and foreign policy, you know, that's also being mirrored here at home domestically. Climate has absolutely been elevated from a domestic policy perspective, but this group will allow for just that regular coordination, and it doesn't necessarily have to be for driving policy decisions, but there are a lot of other elements where it's really critical for the interagency to be working together and coordinating more regularly. And so that will kind of serve as a platform for that. So that's, and I think the other kind of element of it that's important and also just indicative of how we are approaching things in this administration is that it's co-chaired between the NSC and the Office of Science and Technology Policy. So really marrying and making sure that the science community we are working kind of hand in glove on these issues.
Thanks, Jennifer. Roger or Stephanie, do either of you want to jump in and talk about sort of the partnerships and coordination that's ongoing with other international partners? Go ahead, Roger.
Stephanie?
Okay.
Oh, no, I was going to, yeah.
Well,
I cede the floor.
Okay, Stephanie, you go first, please. Thank you.
Sure. No, I can start, and I'm interested in Roger's thoughts on this as well, because I think one of the ways that we can be useful, in addition to certainly the finance, the money is really important, and the on the ground work and the technical assistance is in risk monitoring and information sharing. And we have some of the best resources in the world in the US government, and providing some of those climate services to our international partners, and also making sure that these analyses are part, again, not only of the conversations that our climate focused leaders are having, but routinely part of the dialogues that we have with allies and partners in all kinds of fora, in security dialogues, in bilateral conversations and meetings that our secretaries of state and defense and our intelligence leads are having. Just making this part of those conversations more systematically will be really, really useful. But I'm interested to hear more, or maybe perhaps Roger is in a better position to share a little bit of how that may work, or the work that we're already doing.
No, thank you. So in that context, one of the major collaborative mechanisms that we do have is a set of partnerships across the World Meteorological Organization on the development of the global framework for climate services. And that has been set up since 2009. I co-chair the Climate Service Information System. But what that really means is the question that Stephanie's raising on how we align the monitoring, the forecasting, communication, and risk assessment is being taken very seriously in the context of how we use those to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, to meet the Sendai Agreement and targets. We just released a report this year on drought and water scarcity in the global as a global assessment report. Dr. Lubchenko, the OSTP deputy director, did the release. And as Gillian was saying, the very different aspects of where science fits in on not simply reducing us to being reactive, not simply proactive, if this happens, what do we do, but prospective, how do we get ahead of emerging risks before they actually manifest themselves? And in that setting, the collaboration in the global community to meet these goals, whether they're certainly SDGs, in aligning the scientific capabilities is an active effort going on right now in the development of the next phase of the global framework on climate services. And we can provide more information on that, but it really is about where we're aligning the science that's being produced, characterizing what we know and don't know about those systems, and then what it means at the regional and local level. And now from our standpoint, and the link back to security is the regional specificity and knowledge at the scale of the combatant commands, but then also at the scale at which local and national, public, private, and civil society mechanisms are using and can use scientific information. So we developed the regional collaborations that help provide the guidance. And that is actually a very much long-standing idea, but now you're seeing it centrally in the administration's guidance to how we should do things to get ahead of crafting just transitions, moving through the future by not creating new risks for those who are already at risk. From that standpoint, and I really appreciate the lead in Stephanie, climate services and the way we're thinking about them globally requires more than anything an international collaborative structure that actually allows us to choose the best information at the right time. As Gillian was just saying, we do have these events into the long term, but there's not a one-to-one link with climate. But it is how climate affects the public goods that we're using. So we work very closely with NASA through the severe groups. We work very closely with USGS and the entire forecasting facility from satellites, and with other international organizations, the European Space Agency, the Brazilian INMET, and others to help align these information and services. So that works extremely well. Where we're seeing this as being different is the scaling, the effort to move beyond projects. And that's where I think Stephanie's point is really rich, in that we're actually asking how we align the knowledge, practices, and networks that have been developed through these projects in time into a coherent view into the future. That's the way we get ahead of what we call prospective risk, not letting new risks emerge. So thanks very much, Stephanie. There's a large coordination effort going on, and need the guidance of people on this call.
Yeah, and USAID has a role in this too as well, Gillian. I know Servier is a partnership between USAID and NASA. If you want to take a minute to talk about sort of the agency's role in this international cooperation and collaboration on science.
Yeah, it's something that I'm just learning about, and I'm really excited to learn a lot more. But USAID and NASA have a collaboration called Servier, which combines Earth observing satellites and geospatial technology, and helps provide on-the-ground information regarding climate risks and agriculture and water to communities in over 45 countries worldwide right now. So I think, with technology, there's just tremendous opportunities to forecast challenges and to prepare people whose livelihoods depend on the natural environment for shifts in pricing, for forthcoming drought, for forthcoming deluges of rain, as we saw in Germany, unprecedented levels of rainfall. I think this is an area in which we should be exploring a lot more opportunity. And, we're especially interested in the context of our new strategy in thinking about innovation. Not all innovation needs to be technology driven, but, we need to think about new ways to solve, the sort of the crisis of our lifetimes. Seems like I precipitated a thought from Roger.
Over to you, Roger.
I love the fact, Gillian, that you use the word precipitate every time, since that's where in the context of a climate issue. That's very, very good. So so I wanted to add, simply because of the leadership that USAID has actually taken. All of us are familiar, or many of us of a certain age, with Live Aid and Band Aid, right? The Ethiopian droughts of '84, which precipitated a lot of things, including the Family Early Warning System Network, which actually is very well served by Servier and other partners. During 2015 to 2017, there was actually a worse drought in Ethiopia than the '84, but it didn't really make as much of an international splash because of what Gillian was just saying, the alignment of science and the collaboration on early warning, but most importantly, not just here's my forecast and are you excited, but how is this actually tied to household food security? And because of local work done by IGAD, the International Government Advisory Group in East Africa, and others on the ground, you didn't see the collapse of severe food insecurity in Ethiopia at the time. A definite case in the longitudinal benefit of all of these investments that produced a positive outcome. Quite honestly, tied to that security issue was the fact that Al-Shabaab and others were in the wings waiting to move into Ethiopia should it collapse. And that didn't happen. Similarly, as we're seeing at the same time in places like Somalia, where you didn't have this on the ground sort of enhancement of food security over the previous decades, we saw conflict happening within country. No, it didn't happen where the drought occurred. It happened where people had migrated into areas where it wasn't dry. So the issue of tying climate to some of these questions is really not one of, as we were saying, a one-to-one link, but how it filters into the public goods that we are interested in: water, energy, food, health, and so on. So there are strong cases. And what we're seeing in the administration is an effort to ask the hard question, scale those up and make that in a way in which we operate, as opposed to single projects and cases. And I think that's the alignment challenge, but that challenge is laid down very effectively by the administration, and it pushes the agencies to work together. Thanks.
Roger. I'm going to go to some questions from the audience. And the first one is, and actually I think builds nicely on sort of the direction this conversation's been heading. The first question is from Swati Viravalli, who's a foreign affairs specialist at AFRICOM. Hi, Swati. Could the panelists please define what it means to operationalize climate security? And then the second question, I'm going to give it here so you can have a minute to think about it as well, is where do stakeholders get access to interdisciplinary and authoritative data that spans local to global scales at various timescales? Is this an either or situation? Can we have one particular data set at a particular timescale? So I will wait for one of you to unmute to know who would like to take that first question on how what it means to operationalize climate security. Gillian,
I could just take a quick crack at that. I mean, I alluded to this in the context of the work that we did in Sahel, but at an operational level, when you could, by the way, I'm not going to use the word precipitate in this intervention. I'm going to do my very best. When you're forecasting challenges with respect to natural resources, whether it's land or water, at an operational level, you want to be thinking about what land is drawn upon, who has access to that land, who has rights to that land, what kind of systems of regional, national, and local land governance are in place. Are there other ways that we could improve productive use of land in the context? Are there other crops that we could be thinking about? So, at an operational level, you're really looking quite technically at the geographic environment. You're looking at the cultural environment. You're looking at the governance environment. You're looking at the laws and customs, and you're trying to use formal and informal mechanisms to bridge and broker, peaceful solutions to potentially challenging problems. Unfortunately, I'm not in a position to answer that second question, but I love to hear what it is.
Where do you, Stephanie?
I'll just jump in and I will let Roger speak to the data question. But on the multilateral front, I mean, going off of what Gillian said, that's the kind of thing we're looking at when I mentioned the IOs, the multilateral institutions that we're working with. One of the things that's being discussed in the UN Security Council context is trying to expand the use of climate advisors being part of peacekeeping missions for exactly this reason, to make sure that as we're all working together in some of the most fragile, tense parts of the world, that we're keeping all of those things in mind and able to fold it into the planning.
Roger.
No, thanks. Those are two excellent lead-ins. As we think through this in the context of operationalizing, from a service standpoint, an operation is something that is routinely delivered. And in this context, as we're hearing, part of the operation, because of the complexity of the problem, is the strategic guidance and leadership as part of how we operationalize the use of information at different scales. So there are two categories here, right? Autonomy and accountability, and then efficiency. How are people using information to realize their futures in a better way at the local level? But above that is the coherence among all these different institutions. To operationalize means to create the structure, the collaborative structure that manages across each of those scales. So when we think vertically, what happens locally is guided by what is funded and coordinated internationally. And that alignment is part of the global assessment report we just did, but very well describes the issue that Stephanie just raised. So if services are routinely delivered, and that's what we mean by operations, then we need coordinating mechanisms at regional and local levels. The Regional Outlook Forum, which are created, and they're now called Regional Climate Forum, are the places around the globe. There are now, I think there are about 24 of these around the globe, in which the governments, private sector, and collaborators actually are working to develop the climate services tools, the information systems that work with people at local level. But most importantly, it's decentralized to the point at which the risks are locally defined, and then they work back up to the national level. So within the global framework for climate services, that framework does exist, but it requires all of the capabilities that Stephanie was just describing to make them routine. Create the policy coherence at one level, decentralize to the local level, and provide the finance, which is where a lot of decentralization has failed over time, where we've decentralized without the support to do it. And recognizing the value of the informal sector in the way Gillian was just mentioning, and not trying to sort of systematize innovation. As I like to tell people, like the movie Ratatouille, anyone can cook also means that innovation can come from anywhere, not just the top or even the bottom, or not even just the private sector. But we have, and this I think is a really critical point as we move forward in the context of what Stephanie said, the people that guide those innovations, what we call the norm entrepreneurs, the people that keep the full system in mind, the link from the global to the local, they guide the knowledge transitions. And the way we produce them out of academia and out of our partnerships is ad hoc. And what I think Stephanie's point is guiding us to is how do we learn, and who and how do we train people to work on that interface to guide it most instinctively? Not just how you translate climate information to the local level, but how we understand the uncertainties, and how, in the sense that Gillian is describing, it is embedded in our water, food, and extremes variability and change. So I always like to tell people, yes, let's be proactive, you first. So anyway, thanks, Laura.
Thanks, Roger. There's a question for Gillian in particular from Michael Minkoff at the Cadmus Group about climate finance and its connection to equity and inclusion. Could you speak to what you believe are primary opportunities and challenges as pertain to increases in access and use of climate finance, especially in fragile states, and achieving the agency's important goals for improved equity and inclusivity?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think it relates back to moving beyond talking the talk and really beginning to walk the walk. Because, historically, we're going to need to change some patterns in terms of where the money goes in the context of climate finance. I'm sure across the agency and around the world, really, because these embedded patterns of systemic discrimination have informed how decisions are made. We're in conversation right now with a range of donors and multilateral donors and governments about COP-related announcement pertinent to financing for Indigenous peoples that I think will be really, really important. But even when you think about big funding mechanisms to support Indigenous peoples, I was speaking to an Indigenous leader not so long ago who talked about the fact that the project design for this massive funding mechanism had so many log frames that most of the Indigenous communities couldn't prepare a persuasive proposal to access the funds. And that doesn't mean that they aren't capable of doing the important work. I mean, if you look at the history of successful stewardship by Indigenous communities over millennia, it's clear they know how to steward resources if we don't get in their way. So I think we have to think about the mechanisms by which we solicit proposals, the tools by which we analyze the success, the terms by which we define success. And we also have to think about, going back to solicitation, how we even make people aware that funds are available. There are certain people that are on the Beltway gravy train, and our administrator has talked about the importance of locally led development and of moving towards locally led support. And that's not an easy thing to do when you're, a big machinery. But, I think through unique, USAID's very unique purchase with this on the ground presence in over 80 countries worldwide, that we're in a good position to, to change the dynamics and to make sure that we start to address these systemic inequities through the finance we provide.
Lauren, can I add something very quickly?
Sorry.
I'll take
yes,
that
Roger.
as a yes.
Yeah,
I'll take that as a yes.
Go ahead, please.
So one of the things Gillian's raising is this question, the role that we're talking about. One of the big successes we had in the fifth assessment report in the IPCC was, prior to that, we did a set of reports on not simply how are Indigenous people impacted, but the contributions they actually make to helping us learn about adaptation, and got that language into the IPCC report on the value of Indigenous knowledge in terms of how we think about localities. But as we know, in addition to that, the scale of the risks that we're facing are overwhelming many of our traditional approaches to risk as well. And as when we were developing the Grand Canyon Adaptive Management Program, as the Hopi leader said, adaptive management, we've been here for 10,000 years. What do you mean? So the question here is how we in fact draw on those lessons at the same time as acknowledging that many of the risks, as the some folks in the Arctic call it, that it's Ogianuktuk, right? It is no longer what we know. So how many of those are changing over time that are overwhelming our approaches, whether it's interbasin transfer or local land management? In that setting, giving voice to people is linked back to Stephanie's point about the capabilities. One of the best things we've ever done is in the Caribbean, developing a cadre of professionals trained to work to help give voice to small communities, so that when proposals, actions come in, there are people working with them on how to frame those questions who are in and from those communities. And that's been one of the biggest successes in capacity and enabling capabilities, as opposed to just technology, that I think, and that was funded by State Department. So very good, thanks.
Can I just make one comment, very brief comment? Roger, you stumbled upon a pet peeve of mine there when you talked about giving voice, because what I always think about when I hear that term is that everybody has a voice.
Yeah.
It's that most communities don't have the microphone. They need the microphone, not the voice.
I fully agree.
Just on what you had to say.
No, I fully agree with you. I'm just talking about how the person carrying the mic finds somebody to give it to.
I know.
Yeah. No, I fully agree with you. I know
exactly what you meant.
Yeah, fully agree with you.
Yeah. A question from Adam Siegel at Insight Through Analysis. As we talk about broadening the climate and security discussion and building new muscle, what should we take that there is no traditional national security, Department of Defense representation on this panel? I mean, I'll say part of the answer is in your question, in the focus on broadening the discussion on climate security and the actors that need to be involved in that discussion. Also part of it, like the limitation of the size of a panel and a 90-minute discussion. But Jennifer, I think you can probably speak to DoD's role in the USG efforts on climate security.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. And, it's a great question. And I would say that DoD has been, from the outset, a very active partner in the work that we are doing in the climate security space and, in climate more broadly. To Lauren's point, I think we have been really working to broaden the thinking, widening the aperture, if you will, on how we talk about and what we're doing under this kind of umbrella of climate security. But, if you look at just the leadership from Secretary Austin and Deputy Secretary of Defense Hicks since the outset. In his message to the force in March, Secretary Austin called out climate as a priority and one that would be a key area of focus for the Department of Defense. From almost day one, he has had a senior advisor on climate change who is there helping to coordinate the department's efforts, across all of DoD and the services on climate change. Within the office of the secretary in the policy shop, there is a climate team that is being built out. They are very active. And I will also say the same with respect to the level of engagement from the Joint Chiefs as well. So if you look at the work that we are leading and coordinating here from the NSC, DoD and the Joint Chiefs are there at every single climate conversation, and they are very engaged in this space. And so, they are, again, kind of conducting their very first climate risk analysis. They are integrating climate risk into, how they are doing planning, how they're exercising, et cetera, and really taking a forward-looking and kind of more proactive approach with respect to integrating climate into their efforts.
And Lauren, if I could just chime in quickly too, I wanted to underscore how much cooperation is happening just at the agency level as well. I'm in regular touch with colleagues at DoD, both in the Secretary of Defense's policy shop, but also just yesterday I was meeting with some folks from AFRICOM who are in town. So there is a lot of, we're in lockstep as we're thinking about, and frankly, they're dealing with similar challenges that I was describing at State of how do you make sure it's not just the people with climate in the title that are applying this lens to the decisions and the policy making and the strategy of the department and the services. So we're working to try and navigate that together. We do some, state DoD conversations. Often there are sort of USAID is brought in, and then of course the NSC convenes larger interagency dialogues as well. But I would say I appreciate the effort, and I think we all agree, and frankly, I think DoD would agree in broadening the definition of climate security. So it's not just thinking about the military, but I don't want anyone to take away that this coordination isn't happening at all levels across the board. DoD is clearly a key partner in this.
And
Roger?
just to add to that, Lauren, I think it's an excellent question, but I know it's one you've thought of, Lauren, in the context of being on the panel. I think what you're hearing is, in fact, this effort to really describe the whole of government alignment. How, in fact, are we interacting? Because as both Jennifer and Stephanie just says, we're actually hyperlinks for that broader community because we're working with them. And for the panel, we're trying to give a sense that we're deliberately about the alignment. We're deliberate about thinking through the finance at the different levels. And how that is happening was the goal of the panel from, I think, Lauren, how you led this. So I do, want to make the point, yes, it's we can think of a client or a user, when in our context, we're also thinking, as Stephanie just said, around that, where's the financing, where's the partnership, and who is playing a role that you might not think is just in the defense arena.
Roger. We have a question from Jeff DeBelco, my former boss at the Wilson Center and previous former director of ECSP, who's now at Ohio University. How are U.S. government efforts? This actually, ties back to Stephanie, I had asked you a question about sort of conflict sensitivity at the COP and thinking about how we respond to climate change. And this sort of builds on that a little bit further. So how are U.S. government efforts on climate security taking into account and working to minimize what we call backdraft dynamics or the conflict potential of how we respond to climate through mitigation and adaptation? How do we ramp up the green energy supply chain in ways that minimize rather than exacerbate social conflict? How do we make sure Red Plus schemes assist local affected communities so they support the efforts rather than oppose them? I would broaden that also to think about sort of what a shift in the global sort of a shift to decarbonization means for countries whose GDPs are reliant on fossil fuels, just this effort to address climate and some of the unintended impacts that we could see if we're not being sensitive to the sort of tensions or conflict dynamics that could arise. And Gillian, I wonder if you could, thinking about how USAID is engaging on this, especially through the Center for Conflict and Violence Prevention and some of the conflict work, and how sort of that integration across USAID of climate and security is drawing on those resources as well. Maybe we can start with you.
Yeah, well, as I said earlier, I mean, we have in fact, I was speaking to them yesterday, as you know, Lauren, before coming to this panel. We have some real experts when it comes to conflict violence prevention, and they have very deep insight into, the root causes of violence, how to prevent violence, and the connectivity between violence and natural systems. What we're moving towards with this whole of agency response is, much more collaboration and building stronger connective tissue between all of the different programs across the agency, because they have worked, somewhat more in isolation historically from, say, the humanitarian effort. So I know that there's, a really keen interest in joining up our work and in making sure that we can, as Roger alluded to earlier, be very forward thinking and anticipatory with respect to whatever interventions may be needed. I'm just 1 month into my role, so I don't have deep insight into every single center within the agency, but I'm really looking forward to learning more about how we can strengthen those collaborations.
I think, Lauren, just to add to that, I mean, Gillian is really brand new to the role. Many of us are new to the roles, but in general, we've all talked about the sea change in policy from the last administration. I've seen some chatter and comments about, I don't know what's really going on climate security in the Biden administration. Is it all about sort of the mitigation and the negotiations that Kerry's leading, which of course gets a lot of press attention? I think one of the things we're really trying to do is be very thoughtful in the policies that we're putting forward. So there are a lot of conversations. A lot of the products that Jennifer was speaking to are geared towards improving our understanding of all of these linkages as well, to ensure that as we are moving forward, not just from the conception and strategy development, but to the policy, rollouts and implementations, that we're being careful and thoughtful and not putting the cart ahead of or just sort of charging ahead, whatever metaphor you want to use here, but charging ahead without thinking through all of the follow-on effects. That's something we're trying to be really, really thoughtful about, and why we're sort of taking a lot of time in building these dialogues and gathering the required data, and in developing the processes to develop the policies that will ultimately, we hope, achieve many of the goals we've discussed today.
We have time for one more round. I'm going to try and tie a couple of questions together. The first one's from Paula Brooks. Is there a plan to bring this very much down to the local U.S. level so that citizens and residents truly understand why the action is tied to national security? I think that's a great question. I feel like in my day-to-day life, I feel like, we have these sort of echo chambers of people talking about climate security and understanding the connections. And then I talk to somebody in my family who's like, wait, what? I have to take a step back. And so helping the broader public audience understand how these things connect. Be interesting to hear about that. And then related to that, a question from Beth Chalecki at the University of Nebraska, who's a professor and teaching climate security to her students, and they're avidly interested in it, right? So what kinds of opportunities are there for sort of young professionals and students who want to get engaged in climate security to be engaged? I don't know if it's, through internships with agencies or sort of thinking about like the long-term implications of this sort of systems change and what that means for the workforce, and how do we engage the broader public and also create those pathways forward for people who are interested in careers in space.
I have one quick thought on bringing it home, because we've been talking to the Health and Human Services branch, which is domestically focused here in the U.S., at Cass Sunstein, who is leading a lot of the thinking around policy and also the climate-related response. And we're getting a briefing from the Federal Emergency Management Authority. And that's because the kinds of tools they're developing when it comes to dealing with extreme heat, for example, and the prizes they're sort of instigating to get people to develop low carbon responses to extreme heat situations could be valuable to us. It's also because of the connectivity between climate-induced migration and the challenges HHS is facing on the ground. So, I was speaking with Jen and a range of other colleagues about the Northern Triangle in Central America, and there's a recent study that's forthcoming regarding the relationship between climate change and migration, which we're all aware of, but it hits home when we face migratory influxes within the United States. And I think people need to better understand why people are risking their lives to make it into this country right now. It may not be the easiest conversation to have domestically. It might not even be the best point of entry for helping people understand the national security implications of climate change. But it's certainly a very palpable and visual opportunity to talk about the connections between national security and climate change as it relates to everyday Americans.
Brilliant. Anybody else want to jump in on that? Jennifer?
Yeah, I would just kind of take it back a little bit to, what this looks like here. I think that there's been a real emphasis from the beginning of the administration. We've been hearing a lot about coming from DOE, energy justice, really looking at putting, we've talked today on this panel about making resources more accessible to more people and more communities on the international level. I think we're having that same conversation domestically as well. How are we getting more resources into the communities that really need them and the communities that have been kind of really greatly impacted by climate change, and who are also going to be central as we are working to meet our climate objectives. So, transitioning the energy system, transitioning how we're developing some of our supply chains, et cetera, really focused there. So, we're looking at that front. And then a lot of these are the communities that are also on the front lines of climate change. They're kind of the landing areas for devastating hurricanes or, floods and fires, et cetera. And so looking at how, our recovery efforts can also actually be made more accessible. And we've already seen changes in this administration to that point. And so, I think we're seeing a lot of kind of the focus that we've had internationally in a shift in focus. We're seeing that those same types of shifts here at home with respect to really being able to bring more resources to bear in the communities that really need them.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Oh, and I'll add one more point actually on the how we get young professionals and students engaged. I would say there are a lot of opportunities. One, federal agencies do internship programs, and that's one way if you want to work from a government perspective, have students look into doing summer internships or potentially longer term types of fellowship opportunities within government. But then there are organizations that are focused in the climate security space that are running fellowship programs, et cetera. And there are those available. And I think being able to kind of amplify those and make sure kind of more professors, more students know, and frankly, young professionals know about these opportunities is really something that we can do because there are opportunities out there.
Yes, absolutely. I know the Wilson Center with the American Security Project and Center for Climate Security hosts the Climate Security Fellowship each year. We just got started with our new class of 15 fellows. So encourage you to find information about that on the website and we can make that available. Stephanie and Roger, did you want to jump in?
Stephanie, please.
I think
I'm okay. I don't have much to add on top of what my colleagues just shared, but Roger, if you please go ahead.
Sure. Thanks. So in this context, I mean, the distinction between the policy coherence and action on the ground is exactly this operational piece on what develops and facilitates a culture of partnership. And we see that in the context of something Jennifer was just saying about the liquidity risk. What comes in after an event that allows us to plan for the long term, not just manage the emergency. And that targeting of funds is in that area is part of what we're doing with the UNDR, Geneva Association, and others in trying to get that sense. But to come back to this question about who is to do it and where young professionals, and hi Beth, thank you for the question. One of the places that comes from that is we do have and have tried to develop things like the Regional Integrated Sciences Assessment, the International Research for Climate and Society, the National Drought Mitigation Center, where the focus is not simply training a better climate scientist to talk to people in a communications framing, or another discipline that feeds in, or even interdisciplinarity. It's much more along the lines of how do we craft and who helps us understand knowledge about a process, the climate system, and the changes therein, and knowledge in a process, how people actually make decisions. That's transdisciplinarity, and that's the type of internships and space that is needed. Now, that is what we have tried to do in the Caribbean in the effort I just mentioned. There's an old African saying, if you do something for me without me, it is against me. And the people that we're talking about in terms of how we train to work on that interface are from those very communities who help handle that link. So I just want to make sure that in crafting this link between the coherence and the actions, we're actually training people on that interface, not just to be communicators, but much more than that.
Stephanie,
So I do just have one thing to add that was sort of triggered in me listening to Roger speak. I think that we talk a lot about foreign policy for the middle class in the Biden administration. It's something that Secretary Blinken, it's front and center in his engagement as well. And often we find that when people think about climate change in that context, the middle class, it's in a negative way because we talk about jobs that are moving and industries that are shifting and economic. So trying to connect the dots between the security, the need for climate action, and then also with the job benefits, the economic benefits, and the economic risks associated with doing nothing, it makes it clear. I think changing that narrative a little bit is really important as well, because when you think about security more broadly and global security and stuff that's happening all around the world, really also folks are focused on their economic security. That's a challenge we have in the United States. It's a challenge that a lot of countries have. So tying those two things together, I think, is quite important as well as we're engaging at the community level.
We have 2 minutes left, so I'm going to give you each about 20 to 30 seconds to share with us a call to action. So, what can the audience who is watching from all over the world and from different sectors and agencies and perspectives, what can we do to help support the U.S. government effort on climate security and your all efforts on climate security? Roger, you're unmuted, so you're up.
Oh, well, okay then, thank you. Okay, two things. One is we're understanding the nature and can manage certain types of risks, but do we really understand the thresholds and tipping points that might actually collapse systems? In other words, where the nodes are that collapse systems, from energy to solar winds to other things like that. So the notion of resilience is one in which our networks are protected, not just particular infrastructure. That's one idea. And the other is, as we're doing, and I think is very clear in the Biden-Harris administration, we're taking governance seriously. Within that is the governance of knowledge. As my previous administrators have always said, from Kathy Sullivan, Jay Lubchenco, Rick Spinrad, Tim Gallaudet, make sure science is at the table. And a big part of what we're doing is trying to ensure that our actions are informed by evidence, but is also the most important information, which is how our assumptions are changing over time, and to communicate that.
Jennifer.
Yeah, Two things. I'm going to echo one of Roger's. I think ensuring that science is at the table consistently is critical, and we just can't move away from that. I think the other thing is get climate out of a silo. We have to move away from that approach. We've talked about viewing things and approaching things through a climate lens, and I think that that's really, really critical. Climate can't be off to the side anymore, and I think that is how we are going to be successful in actually addressing the climate crisis.
Thank you, Jennifer. Gillian?
I just want to harken back to what I said earlier about really walking the walk. I think you can help USAID by making sure we're connected to those marginalized communities, to those really innovative actors on the ground who we may not be in touch with right now and who warrant support and engagement. So helping us connect to them, whether through our missions in country or through our, through our bureaus and centers here in Washington, D.C. is very welcome.
Stephanie?
Just piggybacking off of what Jennifer said, I think that everybody who's tuning in today, I assume, has some interest in the climate security nexus. And Lauren, you alluded to an echo chamber. I think one of the best ways to break down those silos is to get involved in conversations that don't have anything to do with climate and bring this perspective to them. So whether that's conferences or discussions at your workplace, or any sort of way that you can find where typical straight and narrow security conversations are happening, publicly, privately, whatever, bringing your expertise to those conversations and your understanding of this nexus, I think will go a really long way.
Absolutely. So I want to thank our panelists today for your contributions to the discussion and for the critical work that you're all doing every day. Thank you to the whole ECSP team, especially Amanda King and Cynthia Brady for your support, and to our partners at Adelphi for giving us the opportunity to be part of this Berlin Climate Security Conference. And thank you to our amazing audio-visual team at the Wilson Center, without whom we'd be nowhere. The recording of today's event will be available on the Wilson Center event page in the next day or so, and we'll be posting a summary of the discussion on our blog, New Security Beat. Thank you all again, and thanks to you all for tuning in and for your great questions. Great day.